The English countryside in the spring of 1944 was a work of art painted on the grandest possible canvas. But this was not a landscape of pastoral beauty, it was a masterpiece of military deception. From the air, German reconnaissance pilots and their intelligence analysts saw exactly what they expected to see, the immense build-up for the inevitable invasion of Europe. They saw tank divisions clustered in the fields of Kent, poised to strike at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. They saw sprawling fuel depots, bustling airfields, and the telltale signs of an entire army group, the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by the formidable General George S. Patton. What they were seeing, however, was an illusion. The tanks were inflatable rubber dummies, the Shermans and Stuarts that could be deflated and moved by a handful of men. The fuel depots were canvas storage bladders and painted tarps. The trucks were plywood shells placed on jeep frames. The airfields were cleverly painted runways on farmland, dotted with fake wooden planes. This grand mirage was the brainchild of an unlikely alliance, British military intelligence and veterans of Hollywood and Broadway. When America entered the war, it didn't just mobilize its factories and farms, it mobilized its dream factories. The War Department sent out a call for artists, designers, illustrators, and sound engineers. Men who had created fantasies for the silver screen and stage were now recruited to create the most important illusion of their lives. They were formed into specialized, top-secret units, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, which would become known as the Ghost Army, and the British Q divisions. Their tools were not rifles and grenades, but brushes, speakers, and air compressors. Their battlefield was the enemy's mind. Their mission, codenamed Operation Fortitude, was simple and audacious: to convince Adolf Hitler and the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, thereby pinning down the powerful German 15th Army and its panzer reserves long after the real invasion had landed on the beaches of Normandy. It was a strategic lie told on a continental scale. The success of D-Day, and the entire campaign in Western Europe, hinged on this deception holding. If the ruse failed, the real forces landing at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches would be met by a swift and overwhelming counterattack that could throw them back into the sea. The pressure on these artist soldiers was immense. They were not just painting scenery, they were painting the path to victory. And as the clock ticked down to June 5, 1944, they prepared to stage their opening night. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was perhaps the most unusual unit in the entire U.S. Army. Its roster read like a who's who of the New York and Los Angeles art scenes. There was Bill Blass, a young man who would become a world-renowned fashion designer, now sewing canvas and painting shadows onto rubber tanks. There was Ellsworth Kelly, a future giant of abstract art, meticulously sketching the details of German vehicles for recognition guides. There were art directors from Warner Brothers and MGM, sculptors, engineers, and radio advertisers. They were soldiers, yes, but they thought like artists. Their basic training was less about bayonet drills and more about the physics of light and shadow, the psychology of perception, and the art of sonic deception. They were organized into 4 platoons, each with a specific artistic specialty. The first was the Visual Deception Platoon. These were the painters, the sculptors, the set designers. Their arsenal consisted of inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even airplanes. But these were not simple balloons. They were intricate replicas, designed to be convincing from a few hundred yards away, the typical altitude of a German reconnaissance plane. They learned to weather their fake vehicles with paint and dirt, to position them in realistic formations, and to leave track marks in the mud leading to their positions, often created by dragging a weighted plow behind a jeep. The second platoon was Sonic Deception. This was the unit's sound department. They had developed a revolutionary system of wire recorders, the precursors to tape recorders, that could capture and play back the sounds of armored and infantry units. They had library reels of tank treads clanking, officers shouting orders, bulldozers digging, and radio operators sending Morse code. They would deploy powerful speakers on the backs of trucks and, under cover of darkness, broadcast this symphony of military life, making a few dozen men sound like an entire division moving into position. The third platoon was radio deception. These men were the scriptwriters of the airwaves. They impersonated the radio operators of real combat units, creating an entirely fake network of signals traffic for the fictitious Fusag. German listening posts, skilled at identifying individual radio operators by their fist, their unique rhythm and style of sending Morse code, were fed a constant, believable stream of false communications that built the narrative of an army preparing to strike at Calais. The fourth element was the combat engineers, who provided security and also helped with the physical construction of the deception, building fake command posts and artillery emplacements out of wood and canvas. This was the Ghost Army, a traveling roadshow of illusionists, descending on a quiet sector of the front, and through a blend of visual, sonic, and radio theater, conjuring an entire fighting force out of thin air. Their success depended on a deep understanding of their audience, the meticulous, logic-driven German intelligence analysts. The deception couldn't be perfect, it just had to be plausible enough to confirm the enemy's existing biases. They weren't creating a perfect lie, they were nurturing a strategic one that the enemy was already desperate to believe. The Sonic Deception Platoon operated under the cover of darkness, their work an exercise in controlled cacophony. While the visual deception was designed for the enemy's eyes in the sky, the sonic deception was for their ears on the ground. The team, led by sound engineers who had worked on Broadway, understood that sound was a visceral, believable proof of presence. A formation of tanks is not just seen, it is heard for miles, the deep, guttural roar of their engines, the metallic screech and clatter of their treads, the shouted commands of their crews. To replicate this, they used heavy, state-of-the-art wire recorders and a series of powerful amplifier towers mounted on half-ton trucks. The process was methodical and nerve-wracking. They would move into a designated area under strict blackout conditions. They would set up their speakers facing the German lines, sometimes just a mile or two away. Then, they would play their pre-recorded symphonies of war. One recording might simulate the sounds of the 5th Armored Division moving into a new bivouac area, the rumble of tanks, the slamming of truck tailgates, the sounds of hammering as crews performed maintenance, the distant chatter of soldiers. Another recording might mimic the sounds of an amphibious landing exercise, with the sounds of landing craft engines and winches. The realism was uncanny. The sound had depth and movement, convincing German listening posts that major troop movements were happening just beyond their view. But this work was incredibly dangerous. The sonic trucks were vulnerable. If a German patrol decided to investigate the noise, the small, lightly armed deception team would be hopelessly outgunned. They developed a routine of playing their recordings for a few hours, then packing up and moving to a new location before dawn, leaving behind only the ghost of an army's presence. The psychological impact on their own Allied troops was also significant. Soldiers in genuine units nearby would often hear the tremendous noise and see nothing, leading to rumors of phantom divisions and ghostly armies moving through the night. The sonic soldiers had to maintain absolute secrecy, unable to even reassure their comrades that the terrifying sounds of an approaching panzer column were, in fact, a carefully orchestrated recording. The success of the sonic deception relied on the German army's own methodology. They were known for their meticulous intelligence gathering. A visual sighting from a reconnaissance plane could be dismissed as camouflage. But the sound of tanks, picked up by multiple listening posts and triangulated, was considered hard, irrefutable evidence. The Ghost Army was feeding this very logical, evidence-based mindset with perfectly crafted false data. They were not just making noise, they were composing a symphony of lies, each movement designed to reinforce the enemy's conviction that the main blow was yet to fall. The night air over the English countryside and later, the front lines in France, became a theater for this audio war, where the most powerful weapon was a well-recorded sound effect. As D-Day approached, the Ghost Army's mission reached its zenith. Operation Fortitude was the overarching strategic deception, and its success was critical. The plan was brilliantly simple in concept but staggeringly complex in execution. Use every tool of deception to make the Germans believe the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. The main invasion, led by the fearsome General Patton's massive 1st U.S. Army Group, Fusag, would strike the Pas-de-Calais. This was the most logical target for the Germans, the shortest crossing, leading directly to the heart of Germany. The Ghost Army's job was to make this logical assumption an unshakable conviction. In the weeks leading up to June 6, 1944, they transformed southeast England into a stage set for an army that didn't exist. Inflatable tank battalions sprouted in fields across Kent. Fake landing craft, constructed from canvas and scaffolding, crowded the ports of Dover and Folkestone, visible to German radar and reconnaissance flights. The radio deception team worked around the clock, creating a cacophony of fake signal traffic for Fusag. They mimicked the distinct fists of real radio operators, discussed logistics for a channel crossing, and even transmitted fake weather reports, all building the persona of a vast, impatient army waiting for its moment to strike. The visual deception teams were meticulous. They knew German intelligence analysts would scrutinize aerial photos. So, they paid painstaking attention to detail. They created shadows for their inflatable tanks by angling them correctly to the sun. They moved the dummies periodically to simulate unit rotations. They left fake tank tracks leading to camouflaged woods that were actually just netting. They even lit campfires at night and had soldiers walk between the fake vehicles to create the illusion of life. The sonic units broadcast the sounds of entire divisions practicing embarkation drills. The deception was a multisensory masterpiece. It played directly into the expectations of the German High Command. When the real invasion landed at Normandy on June 6, the deception didn't end, it intensified. The Ghost Army now had to convince the Germans that Normandy was the feint. For 7 critical weeks after D-Day, while the Allies fought to expand their fragile beachhead, the German 15th Army, with its 19 first-rate divisions, remained in place at Calais, waiting for Patton's ghost. Hitler himself was convinced the main attack was still coming. This delay was a gift of immeasurable value. It allowed the Allies to land hundreds of thousands of troops and millions of tons of supplies in Normandy without facing a devastating counterattack from the best German forces in the West. The Ghost Army, a unit of artists and designers, had successfully pinned down an entire army. They had used paint, rubber, and radio waves to achieve what a corps of infantry could not. After the Normandy landings, the Ghost Army packed up its rubber army and moved to France. Their war was no longer about a single, strategic lie, but a series of tactical deceptions, a traveling road show of illusion performed at the front lines. Their mission was to mislead the enemy about the strength and location of Allied units, to draw fire away from real troop movements, and to mask the mustering of forces for major offensives. They operated with speed and precision, often setting up their deceptions within hours. One of their most famous performances was near Brest in August 1944. The U.S. 6th Armored Division was needed elsewhere, but its presence was required to keep the German garrison bottled up. The Ghost Army was sent in to impersonate the entire division. They rolled into the area with their inflatable tanks and trucks. The sonic unit broadcast the distinctive sounds of a massive armored division on the move. The radio deception team began transmitting fake messages, mimicking the 6th Armor's radio network. To the German defenders, it appeared that a full-strength American division had taken up positions outside the city. The ruse was so successful that the German garrison, convinced they were surrounded by a superior force, delayed breakout attempts for days, allowing the real 6th Armor to slip away to a more critical battlefield. The work was perilous. They were often deployed within range of German artillery. A single stray shell could puncture a dozen rubber tanks, revealing the deception in an instant. They lived with constant tension, knowing their only real defense was the quality of their illusion. They developed a dark humor about their work. They called their inflatables rubber ducks. A successful deception was a good show. A close call with enemy patrols was a bad review. They were actors on the most dangerous stage in the world, and a missed cue could mean capture or death. Their deceptions required immense creativity. To simulate the dust clouds of a moving column, they would drive trucks in circles kicking up dirt. To create the impression of a busy supply dump, they would use a single truck to arrive and depart from the same fake depot repeatedly, taking a different route each time. They were not just building static displays, they were creating living, breathing, moving illusions, all designed to be observed and reported by German intelligence. The Ghost Army became a phantom, appearing at one point on the front to threaten an attack, then vanishing overnight to reappear 50 miles away, convincing the Germans that the Allies had reserves they did not possess. They were a force multiplier of the most extraordinary kind, making a handful of men worth 10,000. The ultimate test of any performance is the audience's reaction, and the Ghost Army's most important critics were the analysts of the German High Command. The success of Fortitude and subsequent deceptions was not just due to Allied cleverness, but also to the willing suspension of disbelief on the German side. The deception played perfectly into German preconceptions and intelligence biases. The Pas-de-Calais was the logical invasion point. Patton was the Allies' most aggressive general, a logical choice to lead the main assault. German intelligence, particularly the Abwehr, had been systematically penetrated by Allied double agents, part of the British double-cross system. These agents, like the famed Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, fed corroborating false information directly to Berlin, reinforcing the illusions created by the Ghost Army. When Garbo reported the movements of fictitious Fusag units, and German reconnaissance planes photographed the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together perfectly. The Germans were looking for a specific picture, and the Allies handed it to them, fully painted and framed. Even after D-Day, the conviction held. When the German 15th Army finally began to move from Calais to Normandy in late July, it was too late. The Allied breakout from the beachhead, Operation Cobra, was already underway. The Ghost Army had bought the most precious commodity of war, time. On the tactical level, German frontline commanders were often baffled. They would report massive enemy buildups, only to see the forces vanish overnight or fail to attack. They would shell what they thought was a tank concentration, only to see the tanks deflate comically. There are accounts of German patrols capturing Ghost Army soldiers and being utterly confused by their equipment, wire recorders, inflatable tanks, and scripts for fake radio transmissions. The Germans, with their focus on engineering and tangible military power, struggled to comprehend an enemy that fought with imagination and illusion. The psychological impact was insidious. It bred a sense of paranoia and uncertainty. German commanders could no longer trust their own intelligence. Was that a real division or a phantom? Was the attack on their front the main effort or a diversion? The Ghost Army sowed a fog of war thicker than any smoke screen, crippling the enemy's ability to make decisive choices. The greatest trick the Ghost Army ever pulled was convincing the world they didn't exist. For over 40 years after the war, their story, as the Allied push through France gained momentum, the Ghost Army's deceptions grew bolder. Their most spectacular performance came during the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. Operation Viersen was their masterpiece. The real Ninth Army was preparing to cross at Rheinberg, but to divert German attention, the Ghost Army was tasked with creating the illusion that the main assault would occur miles to the south, at the city of Viersen. For 5 nights, they staged an elaborate show. They deployed their full arsenal. Hundreds of inflatable tanks and trucks were arranged in realistic formations. The sonic trucks broadcast the sounds of bridge-building equipment, bulldozers, and the movement of heavy armor. The radio deception team created an entire fake corps headquarters, generating a flood of signals traffic about engineering problems and delayed assaults. To add credibility, they requested real air support and artillery barrages on the Viersen sector. The Germans took the bait completely. They concentrated their defenses, including their scarce remaining armor and artillery, at Viersen. When the real Ninth Army crossed at Rheinberg, they met significantly weakened resistance. The Ghost Army had achieved their greatest tactical success, saving an untold number of American lives during one of the last major river crossings of the war. This final act demonstrated the full maturity of their craft. They were no longer just creating static displays, they were orchestrating complex military operations built on lies. They coordinated with real artillery units, real air support, and real infantry patrols to sell their deceptions. Every element of the battlefield was part of their stage. Their final performance came in the war's closing weeks, as they simulated a massive troop buildup to threaten the German city of Karlsruhe, further confusing and dispersing the crumbling German defenses. In their 21 months of operation, the Ghost Army conducted over 20 major deceptions, from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine River. They had impersonated more than 30 different divisions, corps, and armies. Their contribution was immeasurable. Historians estimate their work saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. They fought a war where their most powerful weapon was creativity, and their greatest victory was the bloodshed they prevented. As the war in Europe ended, they packed up their inflatables and wire recorders for the last time. Their final, and perhaps most difficult, mission was just beginning, the mission of silence. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the men of the Ghost Army returned home not as heroes, but as silent veterans bound by secrecy. Their story was considered so vital to national security that it was classified, top secret, and ordered never to be discussed. The reasoning was sound: the Cold War was beginning, and the techniques of military deception might be needed again against a new adversary. The soldiers, from the lowliest private to the commanding officers, honored their oath. They returned to their lives as artists, designers, and engineers, their war experiences a blank page in their personal histories. They could not tell their families what they had done. They could not list their real duties on job applications. When asked about the war, they gave vague answers about being in special projects or headquarters support. Their incredible achievements remained hidden, their heroism unrecognized. This silence came at a personal cost. Many struggled with the psychological weight of carrying such a monumental secret. They had participated in some of the most creative and successful operations of the war, yet they could claim no credit. They watched as other units were celebrated, their battles immortalized in books and films, while their own story gathered dust in a classified archive. The artistic nature of the unit made the silence particularly poignant. These were men whose lives were dedicated to expression, to creating things that would be seen and appreciated. Now, their greatest work, a masterpiece that had saved thousands of lives, was a secret they could not share. For decades, the only place the full story existed was in classified reports and in the memories of the aging veterans themselves. It wasn't until 1985 that the records were partially declassified, and not until 1996 that the full story began to emerge publicly. The long silence. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends far beyond the battlefields of World War II. Their work fundamentally changed the nature of military deception, establishing principles that are still used today. They proved that deception could be a systematic, technological discipline, not just a matter of chance or clever ruses. The modern concept of signature management, controlling the electronic, visual, and acoustic signals a unit emits, is a direct descendant of the Ghost Army's multidisciplinary approach. Their techniques foreshadowed the electronic warfare of the late 20th and 21st centuries. The radio deception teams were early practitioners of information operations, manipulating enemy perceptions through electronic means. The sonic deception units were pioneers in psychological operations, using sound as a weapon to confuse and misdirect. The visual deception platoon's work with inflatables has evolved into sophisticated decoy systems used for everything from protecting aircraft on runways to disguising military installations from satellite surveillance. Perhaps their greatest legacy is in the world of special operations. The Ghost Army demonstrated the incredible effectiveness of small, highly specialized units that could achieve strategic impacts disproportionate to their size. They were a prototype for the modern Special Forces team, elite, adaptable, and trained for specific, high-value missions. But beyond the military applications, the Ghost Army stands as a powerful symbol of the role of creativity in conflict. They were living proof that art could be a weapon, that imagination could save lives, and that sometimes the most powerful way to confront force is not with greater force, but with greater cleverness. Their story is a celebration of the American capacity for innovation and unconventional thinking. When faced with the rigid, predictable warfare of the German army, the Allies responded with a unit that was anything but predictable. The artists, designers, and engineers of the Ghost Army brought a new kind of warfare to the battlefield, a warfare of illusion, where the goal was not to destroy the enemy, but to outthink them. In doing so, they not only helped win a war but also expanded our understanding of what it means to fight. The story of the Ghost Army is more than a curious footnote in military history. It is a fundamental chapter in the story of D-Day and the liberation of Europe. For too long, this story remained in the shadows, its heroes unknown and its achievements uncelebrated. But history has a way of eventually revealing its secrets. Today, we can look back and appreciate the full scope of what these artist soldiers accomplished. They were magicians in uniform, whose stage was the battlefield and whose audience was the German High Command. Their performance in the spring and summer of 1944 was one of the most successful acts of theater ever staged. They convinced an entire army to wait for an attack that would never come, they diverted enemy forces at critical moments, and they saved thousands of lives, all without firing a shot in anger. Their story reminds us that victory in war often depends on many different kinds of courage. There is the courage of the infantryman charging a beach, the courage of the pilot flying through flak, and there is also the courage of the artist setting up a rubber tank within range of enemy artillery, trusting that his brushstrokes will be his protection. It reminds us that innovation and creativity are not separate from the grim business of war, but are often its most decisive elements. The Ghost Army represents the triumph of intellect over brute force, of imagination over dogma. As we remember the great battles and the brave soldiers of World War II, let us also remember the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army. Let us remember the painters who painted the path to victory, the sound engineers who recorded the sounds of phantom divisions, and the radio operators who whispered lies across the airwaves. They proved that sometimes, to liberate a continent, you don't need a bigger army. You just need a better illusion. Their final bow comes late,